I always prided myself on being an observant man. Maybe it came from years of working as a freelance graphic designer, where every detail mattered, or maybe it was just my nature. Either way, looking back, I wish I hadn't been so good at noticing things. It started with the smallest of changes, tiny cracks in what I thought was a perfect marriage. Lisa, my wife of 8 years, had always been bright, driven, and fiercely loyal. At least, I believe she was. She worked at a boutique law firm, and though her job often demanded long hours, she made sure to make time for us. That's what I loved about her. Her ability to balance everything so effortlessly. Or so I thought. The first time I felt the whisper of doubt was on a quiet Tuesday night. Lisa had come home late, her usual excuse about a tough client falling from her lips as she kissed me on the cheek. But something about her demeanor felt different. She seemed lighter, almost radiant. It wasn't exhaustion or frustration from work. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I brushed it off at first. After all, she'd been under a lot of stress lately, and maybe, just maybe, the demanding project she had been working on was finally coming to an end. She deserved to feel good about herself, didn't she? I wanted to believe that was all it was. But then, the late nights became more frequent. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, now seemed glued to her side, vibrating with messages she claimed were from coworkers. Once, I caught her smiling at the screen, a soft, secret smile that wasn't meant for me. When I asked about it, she laughed, brushing my concern aside. "Just a silly meme from Claire," she said. "You know how she loves to send those during meetings." I nodded, forcing myself to believe her. But the whisper of doubt had grown louder, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing away at my trust. Then came the first real red flag. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was cleaning out the garage while Lisa ran errands. I'd been searching for an old pair of hiking boots when I stumbled across a small, crumpled receipt in the corner of her car's trunk. It was from a local cafe, one we rarely visited. What caught my eye wasn't the name of the cafe, it was the timestamp. Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m., a time when Lisa should have been at work. And the receipt was for 2. I told myself it didn't mean anything. She could have been meeting a colleague, or maybe even Claire. But the whisper of doubt turned into a roar that night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Lisa slept soundly beside me. That was when I decided to follow her. Not because I wanted to catch her doing something wrong. No, it was because I needed to prove myself wrong. I needed to kill the doubt once and for all. What I discovered shattered my world. The plan was simple. I would wait for one of her late-night work meetings and follow her. Not because I wanted to play the role of a jealous husband, but because the uncertainty was eating me alive. I needed proof, not just to confront her, but to quiet the storm raging inside my head. Thursday evening came, and as expected, Lisa informed me she had to stay late to finish some briefs for an important client. "Don't wait up," she said with a kiss that felt mechanical, devoid of its usual warmth. As she backed out of the driveway, my heart raced, not with anger, but with dread. I gave her a 10-minute head start before I slipped into my own car. Keeping my headlights off, I followed her at a distance. She didn't head toward her office downtown. Instead, she drove to the other side of town, past the familiar streets we frequented together. The route felt alien, uncharted, like I was being led into a part of her life I was never meant to see. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, the same cafe from the receipt. I parked a block away and watched from the shadows. Lisa stepped out of the car, smoothing her skirt and glancing around nervously before walking inside. My heart sank. She was meeting someone, of that, I was certain. I waited, unable to breathe, until I saw him. He was tall, younger than me, and wore the bright red uniform of a supermarket employee. He stepped out of the cafe and opened the door for her, his face lighting up as he saw Lisa. "My Lisa." She smiled at him, and it wasn't the polite, distant smile she reserved for strangers. It was warm, intimate, a smile I hadn't seen in years. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I wanted to storm inside, demand answers, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I stayed frozen, watching as they sat down at a table near the window. They leaned in close, their heads nearly touching. She laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm. The way she looked at him, the way her eyes sparkled, it was unmistakable. She was in love. Or infatuation. Either way, it wasn't with me. An hour passed before they stood up to leave. I followed them as they walked to his car. He opened the passenger door for her, and she climbed inside without hesitation. They drove off together, leaving me standing in the cold, my mind racing. For hours, I drove aimlessly through the city. The image of her with him burned into my brain. I returned home to an empty house, the silence almost deafening. When Lisa finally came back, she smelled of cheap cologne and excuses. "Work ran late," she said casually, dropping her bag by the door. I nodded, forcing a smile. Inside, something shifted. The doubt was gone, replaced by something darker. Resolve. That night, I lay in bed beside Lisa, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with betrayal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him. The way she laughed, the way she touched his arm, the way she looked at him. My chest burned with a mixture of anger and heartbreak, but I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal, and I needed to plan my response carefully. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in uncovering the truth. It wasn't enough to have seen her with him. I needed undeniable proof. My first step was to track her movements. I purchased a small GPS tracker online, discreet enough to slip into her car without her noticing. It felt like something out of a spy movie, but I didn't care. If she was going to sneak around behind my back, I'd make sure I knew exactly where she was going. Installing the tracker was easier than I'd imagined. That Saturday morning, Lisa mentioned she had to run errands. As she took her usual long shower, I seized the opportunity to slip the device into the lining of her trunk. My hands trembled, but not with fear. This was purpose. I was taking control, no longer a passive observer in my own life. While Lisa was out, I began combing through her social media accounts. Her Facebook and Instagram showed nothing out of the ordinary. Smiling selfies, pictures of us at family gatherings, motivational quotes about love and loyalty. It was almost laughable, the facade she'd managed to maintain. Then I checked her email. She'd always used the same password for everything, so gaining access was easy. What I found was a carefully curated web of deceit. Hidden among the mundane work correspondence were emails to someone named Kyle. The name instantly struck a chord. The supermarket worker. Their messages weren't explicitly romantic, but they carried a level of intimacy that made my stomach churn. She'd talk about how much she looked forward to seeing him, how he made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in years. But the most damning piece of evidence came when I checked our shared phone plan online. A detailed log of text messages and calls painted a clear picture of her obsession with him. They talked every day, often during hours when she told me she was in meetings or staying late at work. It was all there in black and white, proof of her lies. By Sunday night, I had gathered everything I needed. My GPS tracker showed she'd been at the cafe again earlier that day. Her emails and call logs painted a damning picture of emotional and likely physical infidelity. The rage I'd felt initially had cooled into a cold, calculated determination. This wasn't just about confronting her. This was about taking back control of my life. I decided to confront her the following evening, but I wouldn't shout or accuse. I'd make her tell me the truth, and I had a plan to ensure there would be no way for her to deny it. Monday evening arrived, and my heart raced with anticipation as I prepared for what was to come. Lisa had texted earlier, saying she'd be home around 7 p.m. after another long day at work. The words burned as I read them, knowing exactly where she'd been. She wasn't working late. She was with him. The GPS tracker confirmed it. Her car had been parked outside the same cafe for over an hour that afternoon, then at a motel on the outskirts of town. I had spent the day preparing. Every email, call log, and message was printed and laid out neatly on the dining table. The receipts from the cafe and the motel were there too, small but significant pieces of evidence. I'd even compiled screenshots of her social media activity, highlighting the carefully timed posts that corresponded with her meetings with Kyle. If she wanted to deny it, I would leave her no room to wiggle out of the truth. When Lisa finally walked through the door, She greeted me with her usual casual smile, dropping her purse on the counter as if everything was normal. I stood in the dining room, silent, my arms crossed. It took her a moment to notice the table, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the documents spread out before her. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "I think you already know," I replied, my tone calm but icy. Lisa's smile faltered, and she took a step closer to the table, picking up one of the printed emails. Her face paled as she read the words. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice shaking now. "It doesn't matter where I got it," I said, stepping closer. "What matters is that it's the truth. You've been lying to me, Lisa. You've been seeing him." For a moment, she didn't speak, her hands trembling as she set the paper down. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, really?" I scoffed, pointing to the motel receipt. "Because this looks exactly like what I think it is. Care to explain why your car was parked at a motel with Kyle this afternoon? Or why you've been texting him every day for months?" Lisa opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, tears welling in her eyes. She sat down heavily in the chair, her head in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "I wasn't looking for this, but I felt so empty, so disconnected from us. And Kyle, he made me feel alive again." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. "So, your solution to feeling disconnected was to destroy everything we built? To sneak around behind my back?" My voice rose despite my attempt to stay calm. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I still love you, I do. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I spat. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or leaving the stove on. This is a choice. A series of choices." Lisa reached out, but I stepped back. I wasn't ready to forgive. "I need space," I said, my voice cold. "You need to decide what you want, but understand this. The person you've become, I don't know if I can live with her." And with that, I left the room, leaving her sobbing at the table, surrounded by the wreckage of her lies. I barely slept that night. Lisa's sobs echoed through the house, muffled behind the closed door of our bedroom, where she'd locked herself away. I'd opted for the couch, unable to stomach the idea of sharing a bed with someone who'd betrayed me so deeply. The documents I'd shown her lay scattered on the dining table, a grim reminder of the reality I now faced. As dawn crept through the windows, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. They all fought for dominance, leaving me utterly drained. I'd always thought of our marriage as unshakable, something built on a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. But now, that foundation was cracked, and I wasn't sure it could be repaired. The sound of footsteps broke through my thoughts. Lisa stood in the doorway to the living room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She held a mug of coffee in her hands, offering it to me like a peace offering. I sat up, hesitating, before taking the cup. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken apologies and unanswered questions. "I didn't sleep," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "I stayed up all night thinking about what you said, about what I've done." I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was lukewarm, but I didn't care. "And?" I asked, my tone flat. Lisa hesitated, wringing her hands together. "I know I've destroyed your trust," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to fix this. I want us to fix this." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Instead, they felt hollow, like a bandage too small to cover a gaping wound. "You want to fix this now," I said bitterly. "After months of sneaking around? After lying to my face every day? Do you have any idea what this has done to me?" Lisa flinched but didn't look away. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Counseling, honesty, whatever you want. I'll cut all contact with Kyle. I'll do anything." Her desperation was palpable, but it wasn't enough to sway me. "Do you even know why you did it?" I demanded, my voice rising. Was it about him? Was it about me? Or were you just bored with our life? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. It wasn't about you, or him, or boredom. It was about me, she admitted. I felt invisible, like I'd lost who I was outside of being your wife. Kyle, he gave me attention, made me feel wanted. Her words stung, but I could tell she believed them. Still, they didn't absolve her of her choices. You felt invisible, so you made me invisible too, I said quietly. You shattered my trust, my sense of security. And now you want me to pretend that never happened? Lisa dropped to her knees, clutching my hands. No, I don't want you to pretend. I want a chance to prove I can be better. To prove I can be the woman you deserve. I pulled my hands away, my heart aching at the sight of her so broken. I don't know if that's possible, I said, standing up. You've taken something from me that I can't get back, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again. I left her there, kneeling on the floor, as I walked out the door to clear my head. The morning air was crisp, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the realization that the woman I loved might not exist anymore. Walking through the neighborhood that morning felt surreal. The streets were quiet, the world oblivious to the storm tearing my life apart. Couples jogged together, kids played on lawns, and an older man down the street was watering his flowers, humming to himself. The normalcy of it all was almost insulting. Didn't the universe realize everything in my world had just collapsed? I found myself at the small park a few blocks from our house, the one Lisa and I used to visit when we first moved into the neighborhood. Back then, we'd bring a blanket, a bottle of wine, and talk for hours. It had been years since we'd done anything like that. Somehow, sitting on one of the empty benches now felt like an act of defiance against those memories, like I was reclaiming this space for myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the quiet. I pulled it out to see a text from Lisa. Please come home. We need to talk. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What was there left to say? She'd made her choices, and now we were here, standing in the wreckage of her decisions. But a part of me couldn't ignore her plea. Maybe it was the faintest flicker of hope, or maybe it was just habit, this instinct to try to fix what was broken. I typed back a short response, later. Hours passed before I found the courage to return home. When I opened the door, the house was eerily quiet. Lisa was sitting at the dining table, the same spot where I'd confronted her the night before. The stack of evidence was gone, replaced by a single piece of paper. She looked up as I entered, her eyes swollen from crying. I wrote you a letter, she said softly, pushing the paper toward me. I hesitated, then sat down and picked it up. Her handwriting was shaky, her words smudged with what looked like tear stains. I began to read. Dear Alex, I don't know where to begin, but I need you to hear me. Not my excuses, not my justifications, just me. I know I've broken us, and I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. But it's the only place I can start. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. When I met Kyle, I was vulnerable, searching for something I didn't even realize I'd lost. It doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. He gave me attention, made me feel alive again. But I never stopped loving you. I hate myself for the pain I've caused you, for the lies, the betrayal, the nights I chose him over us. You didn't deserve any of it. You've been nothing but good to me, and I threw it all away. If I could take it back, I would. But I can't. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness, though I know I have no right to it. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, even if it means letting you go. Because all I want is for you to be happy, even if it's without me. I love you, Alex. I always will. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. I looked up at Lisa, and for the first time in days, I saw her. Not the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who was now broken, just like me. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly, but I also don't know if I'm ready to walk away. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait. Her words hung in the air, full of hope and despair all at once. For now, that was all we had. Uncertainty. The days following Lisa's letter were a blur of cautious conversations and suffocating silences. I had agreed to stay, But the reality of what that meant was far more complicated than I'd imagined. Forgiveness wasn't a light switch I could flip on and off, and every interaction with Lisa felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong step, and we'd both plummet into the void. We decided to try counseling. Or rather, Lisa suggested it, and I reluctantly agreed. The first session was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening. In the meantime, we lived in a fragile truce, coexisting in the same house but orbiting each other like distant planets. There was a tension in every room we shared, every glance exchanged, as if we were both waiting for the other to say something that would end it all. One evening, about a week after her confession, I found Lisa in the kitchen, cooking dinner. It was such a mundane sight, yet it felt foreign. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, and she was humming softly to herself, a tune I vaguely recognized from years ago. For a moment, I almost forgot everything, almost let myself believe we were normal again. But then the scent of the food reminded me of the dinners she'd likely shared with Kyle, and the moment shattered. "Smells good," I said, my voice stiff. She turned, startled, as if she hadn't noticed me standing there. "Thanks," she said softly. "It's your favorite." I thought, maybe. Her voice trailed off, and she focused back on the skillet, flipping the chicken as it sizzled. I wanted to appreciate the gesture, to see it as an olive branch. But instead, it felt like an apology I hadn't asked for. "You don't have to do that," I muttered, leaning against the counter. "I know," she replied, not looking at me. "I just wanted to." Her effort should have touched me, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. "Dinner won't fix this," I said, the words sharper than I intended. Lisa flinched, setting the spatula down. "I know that too," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she adjusted the burner. "But I have to try something." "Anything?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not trying to be cruel. It's just, this doesn't feel real. None of it does. One minute, I think I can do this, and the next, I feel like I don't even know who you are." Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, nodding. "I don't expect you to know yet," she said. "I barely know myself right now, but I want to. I want to figure it out with you." I wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope she offered. But trust wasn't something I could summon at will. "We'll see," I said, pushing off the counter and heading for the living room. "I guess we'll see." Dinner that night was quiet, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Each bite tasted like compromise, a mix of bitterness and longing for something we'd lost, something I wasn't sure we'd ever find again. The day of our first counseling session arrived, and with it came a storm of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Part of me didn't want to go, didn't want to sit in a sterile office and unravel the knots of our broken marriage under the scrutiny of a stranger. Another part of me knew it was our only chance, a lifeline that might keep us from drowning entirely. Lisa drove us there in silence. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, and I caught her glancing at me nervously from time to time. I kept my gaze fixed out the window, watching the city blur past. The car felt like a pressure cooker, every unspoken word threatening to boil over. By the time we pulled into the parking lot, my chest was tight with anxiety. The office was exactly what I expected. Warm lighting, neutral colors, and a bookshelf stacked with titles about relationships and self-help. The counselor, Dr. Bradley, greeted us with a firm handshake and a kind smile that only deepened my discomfort. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, leaving a chasm of space between us as she settled into her chair. "So," Dr. Bradley began, her voice calm and measured, "why don't we start with what brought you here?" Lisa glanced at me, her eyes pleading for me to speak first. I crossed my arms, unsure where to begin. "Infidelity," I said flatly. The word felt heavy in my mouth, like lead. "Lisa cheated on me." Dr. Bradley nodded, her expression neutral. "Thank you for being honest, Alex." "Lisa, how do you feel about what Alex just said?" Lisa looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "It's true," she said softly. I betrayed him. I hurt him in ways I can't even put into words, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her confession settling over us. Dr. Bradley leaned forward slightly. "Lisa, why do you think this happened?" Lisa's voice shook as she answered. I felt lost. Like I wasn't enough. Like I wasn't the woman Alex fell in love with anymore. And instead of facing that, instead of talking to him, I looked for validation somewhere else. Her words stung, but they weren't new to me. I'd heard them before, in our kitchen, in her letter. What I hadn't heard was how she planned to move forward. And what now? I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. What's supposed to fix this? Dr. Bradley raised a hand gently, steering the conversation. That's what we're here to figure out, Alex. Healing doesn't happen overnight, and rebuilding trust will take time. But the fact that you're both here, willing to have this conversation, is a start. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that sitting in this room, airing our wounds, could somehow lead to a future where this pain didn't define us. But as I sat there, staring at the woman I loved and hated in equal measure, I couldn't help but wonder if love was enough. By the end of the session, we'd barely scratched the surface. Dr. Bradley gave us homework, a list of questions to discuss together, things like, what do you need to feel safe in this relationship? And what does forgiveness mean to you? They felt impossible to answer. As we left the office, Lisa reached for my hand. For a moment, I let her hold it. Her grip was shaky, unsure. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either. The road ahead felt impossibly long, and I wasn't sure we'd make it to the end together. The drive home from the counseling session was as tense as the session itself. Lisa's hand rested on her lap, fidgeting with her wedding ring, while I kept my eyes on the road, avoiding her gaze. My mind was buzzing with the questions Dr. Bradley had posed, questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. Once we got home, Lisa set her purse down and turned to me. Do you want to start on the questions tonight? She asked cautiously. Not yet, I said, shaking my head. I need to think. Lisa nodded, retreating to the kitchen. I heard the faint clatter of dishes, but I stayed in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. It wasn't the questions I needed to think about, it was her. How had we gotten to this point? How had I missed the cracks forming in our foundation? The next evening, after dinner, Lisa sat across from me at the table, the questions Dr. Bradley had given us neatly written out on a sheet of paper. I think we should talk, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. I sighed, sitting down reluctantly. All right, let's do this. The first question was deceptively simple. What do you need to feel safe in this relationship? Lisa went first. I need honesty. From both of us. No more secrets, no more pretending everything's fine when it's not. Her answer surprised me. I'd expected her to deflect, to make excuses, but instead, she was putting herself on the line. I need consistency, I said. If you say you're going to do something, do it. If you say you're going to be somewhere, be there. I can't live in a world where I'm constantly questioning everything. Lisa nodded, scribbling something in the margins of the paper. I can do that, she said softly. The next question hit harder. What does forgiveness mean to you? Lisa hesitated. Forgiveness. It means letting go of the anger, the pain, but not forgetting. It means choosing to move forward, even if the past still hurts. I stared at her for a long moment. To me, forgiveness is something you have to earn. It's not a gift. It's not automatic. You'll have to prove that you deserve it. Her face crumpled slightly, but she nodded. I will. I'll do whatever it takes. By the time we finished, the air between us felt lighter, but the weight of what lay ahead still loomed. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of something I hadn't expected, hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. The weeks that followed were painstakingly slow. Counseling became a regular part of our routine, and though each session brought incremental progress, it also dredged up new wounds. Lisa and I had agreed to set boundaries. She cut all contact with Kyle and deleted every message, every trace of their affair. I made sure to verify it, but even then, trust didn't come easily. Lisa threw herself into the process, scheduling date nights and surprising me with small gestures. Cooking my favorite meals, leaving notes of apology in my work bag. Each act felt bittersweet, like she was trying to rebuild something she wasn't sure would stand. One evening, she asked me to join her for a walk. I just want to talk, she said, her tone earnest. As we strolled through the park near our house, she confessed something that caught me off guard. I hated myself every time I saw you after being with him, she said, but I didn't know how to stop. I felt addicted to the escape. Her words stung, but they also felt honest. Why didn't you come to me? I asked. Why didn't you tell me you felt this way? I didn't want to admit I was failing. To you or to myself, she said, tears in her eyes. But I see now that hiding it just made everything worse. For the first time in months, I felt like she was finally letting me in. Despite the progress we were making, a darker part of me still lingered. I couldn't help but think about Kyle, the man who had stepped into my marriage and taken something sacred from me. The thought of confronting him, of making him pay for what he'd done, was a constant temptation. One night, I found myself parked outside the supermarket where Kyle worked. I sat there for hours, watching him through the glass doors as he stocked shelves, laughed with coworkers, went about his life as if nothing had happened. My fists clenched on the steering wheel. How could he go on so easily while my life was in pieces? But I didn't go inside. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that battle. Not until I figured out what I hoped to gain, I realized that part of the healing process wasn't just about Lisa. It was about me. I'd spent so long trying to fix our marriage that I'd lost sight of my own needs. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. I reconnected with old friends, rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten. Lisa noticed the change. You seem lighter, she said one evening, her voice tentative. I'm trying to be, I replied honestly, but it's not easy. For the first time, she didn't push. She simply nodded, giving me the space I needed. The day I finally confronted Kyle was unplanned. I ran into him at a coffee shop, his presence catching me off guard. He froze when he saw me, his confident smirk faltering. Alex, he stammered, setting down his drink. I didn't expect. You didn't expect to see me? I said, my voice cold. Or you didn't expect me to find out? Kyle swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. Look, I'm sorry. Sorry? I cut him off. You knew she was married. You knew exactly what you were doing. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, he said weakly. You didn't care who you hurt, I spat. You're just a coward who couldn't keep his hands off someone else's life. Kyle didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. I turned and left, my chest heavy but my resolve stronger. I wouldn't let him control my thoughts any longer. Months later, I sat across from Lisa at the dining table. The air between us was different now, less charged, more tentative. I've been thinking a lot about us, I said. Lisa nodded, waiting. I think we can try again, I said, my voice steady. But only if we rebuild from the ground up. No more secrets, no more lies. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached for my hand. I'll do whatever it takes. Rebuilding wasn't easy. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments of doubt. But there were also moments of connection, shared laughter, honest conversations, and glimpses of the love we'd once had. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lisa turned to me. Thank you, she said softly, for giving us a second chance. I looked at her, seeing both the woman who had hurt me and the woman who was working tirelessly to heal us. Thank you for earning it, I replied. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for now, that was enough.